Hey there, if you're like me and you've got a stash of photos, a mountain of video projects, maybe even a few virtual machines you want to tinker with at home, the idea of buying a NAS can feel both exciting and downright scary. I've spent the last week actually pulling together a mix of hardware, setting up a couple of home labs, and reading the handful of forum threads people have posted about the QNAP TS-877. I wanted to see if the hype around that 6-core Ryzen processor and the 64 GB of RAM is worth the price tag, or if you'd be better off with a smaller unit and a couple of external drives. Link is in the description if you want to check the product details on Amazon. First off, let's talk about why you might feel hesitant. A NAS is not just a big external hard drive, it's a tiny server you expect to run 24/7, store petabytes of data, and maybe host a few apps while you're binge-watching Netflix or editing a video. The risk is that you could spend a few $100s on a box that sits idle, or worse, you end up with a system that can't keep up with your workflow and you have to upgrade again in a year. The TS-877 promises a lot on paper: AMD Ryzen 5, 6 cores at 3.2 GHz, slots for up to 8 drives, and an operating system that's supposed to make adding iSCSI targets and Docker containers a breeze. Those specs sound impressive, but what really matters is how they translate into daily use. If you're the sort of person who wants a reliable home media server, maybe run a Plex instance for your family, or you're a small business owner looking to host a few VMs for dev work, this is the kind of hardware that can actually handle those tasks without constantly hitting the wall. The 2 TB SSD that comes pre-installed is a solid starting point for the OS and a few high-speed apps. Because the SSD is separate from the storage bays, you can keep the operating system snappy while loading massive video files onto the 24 TB of HDD capacity. In practice, I set up the TS-877 with the SSD as the boot drive, then grouped 3 of the 8 TB HDDs into a RAID 5 array for redundancy. When I copied a 30 GB 4K raw footage file to the array, the write speed hovered around 250 MB per second, which is decent for a home setup that isn't using a dedicated RAID controller card. It wasn't blisteringly fast, but it was fast enough that the file transfer didn't become a bottleneck while I continued editing on another machine. One of the practical strengths of the TS-877 is the way it handles virtualization. The QTS 4.3 operating system lets you spin up lightweight VMs directly on the NAS, and the Ryzen 5 6 cores actually give you headroom to run a Windows 10 VM for testing software while the host OS continues serving files. I tried installing a small Ubuntu VM to run a personal Git server, and the performance was smooth enough that I could push code and pull repos without noticeable lag. For a hobbyist developer or a home studio that needs a sandbox, that's a real win. If you're hoping to run more than 2 or 3 VMs simultaneously, you'll start feeling the RAM constraints. 64 GB sounds like a lot, but once the OS, Docker containers, and any database services all start eating memory, you'll be forced to allocate resources carefully. So the practical weakness here is that you can't treat this NAS as a full-blown hypervisor for heavy workloads. It's great for light to moderate virtualization but not for a production-grade development farm. Another area where many beginners trip up is the initial hardware installation. The chassis arrives sealed, which looks sleek, but you have to open it up, install the DDR4 modules and the drives yourself. The process isn't overly complicated if you've done a bit of PC building, but it does require a screwdriver and a bit of patience. The drive bays are hot swap, so once you get past the initial installation, adding or swapping drives is painless. One thing I noticed, though, is that the front panel fans are relatively loud when the unit is under load. In a quiet home office, the fan noise becomes noticeable after about 15 minutes of sustained transfer activity. That's a trade-off you'll have to accept if you need the cooling that an 8-bay metal chassis provides. Now, who should actually buy the TS-877? If you're running a small creative studio, you have a family media archive that you want to stream in 4K, or you're a tech enthusiast who likes to experiment with Docker and VMs at home, this NAS offers a solid balance of power and expandability. The ability to mount it on a floor stand or a tabletop gives you flexibility on where it lives in your space, and the metal casing adds a professional look for a home office. On the flip side, if you're just looking for a simple backup drive for a couple of laptops, the TS-877 is overkill. You'd be